Hello, dear friends. It is not possible to generalize, because in religions there is everything as in an apothecary's shop, good, bad, or fair, and the presumption of innocence must be applied. But there are always some black chippies, because the human condition is miserable, and sometimes the saying, think wrong and you will be right, works. Opinion piece. Religious abuses. Excesses in all religions. Money seals consciences. Beatles' disappointment in India. The human condition is miserable. The spirit is strong, but the flesh is weak. No need to be a slave to become enlightened. Let's start. One of the hardest lessons I have learned is that all religions, without exceptions, are more or less contaminated by practices that contradict their own moral teachings, and Buddhism is no exception. Last night, I couldn't sleep after watching a French documentary on alleged cases of abuse within Tibetan Buddhism, which were reported to the Dalai Lama himself, but he kept silent for years so as not to damage the prestige of his religion or his sources of funding. I feel more pity than indignation. In 2018, after meeting with 4 people who claimed to have survived sexual assaults in European Buddhist communities, the Dalai Lama admitted to having knowledge of abuse in Buddhist circles since the 90s. In quotes, I already knew about these things. It's nothing new, he said in an interview with the Dutch public television channel, adding that, in quotes, someone mentioned the problem of sexual allegations to him 25 years ago. According to the Dalai Lama, abusers do not care about the Buddha's teachings, and he has consistently denounced such irresponsible and unethical behavior, in quotes, but in the end refused to sign a statement on the matter on the advice of his advisors. The second fact I discovered is that the Dalai Lama is more a political institution than a religious one, and is therefore driven more by political than spiritual interests. In fact, this institution was historically born out of a civil war. In March 2011, the Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, announced that he was stepping down from all political positions held by the Tibetan government in exile to remain only as a spiritual and religious leader. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989 and thus gained worldwide notoriety. Tibetan Buddhists consider the Dalai Lamas to be the incarnations of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig, the patron saint of Tibet, and believe that after his death, his subtle consciousness takes an interval of 49 days at most to reincarnate in an infant who can give signs of his special character from birth. In the history of the Dalai Lamas, some were poisoned to death by internal power conspiracies, just as some of the popes of Rome were poisoned to death. Prestige. The moral strength of Tibetan Buddhism derives from the Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1959, which triggered religious persecution, cultural genocide, and the destruction of monasteries, works of art, and ancient libraries that were the cultural heritage of all humankind. This persecution gave it a moral force that other religions didn't have, just as the persecution of Christians was the catapult for the worldwide launching of Christianity, and then a series of historical mistakes were committed, such as the Crusades and the Inquisition. Also, in the balance is the Dalai Lama's worldwide prestige for his pacifist stance in the struggle for Tibetan independence, but this prestige has been called into question lately by a cause that I do not quite believe, not because I do not believe that the spirit is strong but the flesh is weak, but because I do not believe that a fox like His Holiness would be so clumsy as to screw up in such a way, unless he is not the original one but a double, because clones are very clumsy. The problem is that a community of Tibetan exiles was created in India and around the world with few resources of funding of its own, relying on donations from Western and large international institutions run by big philanthropists of dubious curriculum vitae. When one depends on donations to survive, money can seal many consciences so as not to spoil their sources of funding. The problem with most of the world's religions is that they do not have their own sources of funding, so they depend on the donations of their followers to survive, and this dependence can lead to servitude and corruption. Like that village priest who preached to his parishioners every Sunday from the pulpit that money is very bad and that is why they had to give it to him to purify it. Thus spake Zarathustra. We tend to believe that when an enlightened hermit sage comes down the mountain from his cave to preach his teachings to the world like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, he usually comes down pure and then falls into temptation when surrounded by beautiful young disciples and very generous donors, as has happened in the case of so many gurus. But in the case of Tibetan Buddhism, there was already some small-scale pollution of origin. I say small scale because most of the traditional Tibetan monasteries were small and humble, and were only supported by the harvest donations of modest villagers, and therefore there was not much wealth to corrupt. Remember the Maharishi's harassment of Mia Farrow that caused the Beatles to flee India? In February 1968, the Beatles traveled to Rishikesh and joined a group of 60 people, including musicians Donovan, Mike Love of the Beach Boys, and Paul Horn, as well as Mia Farrow, to attend a transcendental meditation course at the ashram of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The Beatles' interest in the Maharishi changed Western perceptions of Indian spirituality. Lennon and Harrison stayed for almost 6 weeks, but left the ashram abruptly after the Maharishi's inappropriate behavior with his female students. This inspired the song Sexy Sadie. The original title was Maharishi. In quotes, Sexy Sadie, what did you do? You made fools of us all, were the opening lines, but it was changed at Harrison's request. In addition, the Maharishi asked the Liverpool band for between 10 and 25% of their income, the biggest tithe in the world. The Beatles didn't even listen to the proposal. They made the decision to leave because of the curious inappropriate behavior with several of the women in the group. Mia Farrow described such advances by the Maharishi and the situation of physical contact with one of his young female disciples. Once the decision was made to leave the ashram, Lennon and Harrison met with the Maharishi to tell him. The Guru asked them intrigued as to why they were leaving Rishikesh. You tell me, said Lennon, if you are as enlightened as you say you are, I'm sure you know why. John was the most disappointed of all. He saw the man who sold himself as spiritual as too concerned with money, fame, celebrity, and women. Problems. When some modest Tibetan monks came to the West, they created large monasteries with the donations they received from their devotees, and in some cases these monasteries became luxurious and were divided into two communities, one for the rich and famous and the other for poor Buddhists. The same thing happened in medieval Christianity, where there were first, second, or third class convents, depending on the family fortune of the nun or friar. It was precisely the reforms of Saint Teresa of Jesus and Saint John of the Cross that sought to put an end to these class distinctions. Another problem with the Tibetan Tantric tradition is that the absolute dependence of the disciple on his personal guru lends himself or herself to all kinds of abuses unless the guru is an absolutely pure and incorruptible being, which I rather doubt in the human being, knowing how miserable human beings can sometimes be when they have too much power over the other beings. That is why it is very important that each spiritual student takes his own responsibility and doesn't yield his power to any master. It's not necessary to be a slave to anyone in order to become enlightened. It's important to note that these cases are not unique to Tibetan Buddhism and can occur in any religious or spiritual context where there is an unequal relationship of power and authority. The appropriate response is to take all allegations of abuse seriously, investigate them properly, and take steps to prevent future abuse. Personal disappointments. The only personal meeting I had with Tibetans in India many years ago was to ask me for money, or rather for financial sponsorship. And my answer was that I was only a paid worker, not a millionaire philanthropist. At that point, they lost all interest in me. The second encounter I had was at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. When I tried to do some research on the ancient Lama Chunchung, the librarian's response was absolutely rude, and he threw me out in a huff. Perhaps he thought I was just another crazy Westerner in search of his Tibetan reincarnation. I knew beforehand that I was going to be refused. I also had a disappointment with Lama Zopa. At the Tushita Meditation Center, an old colonial house on a hill above MacLeod Ganj in Dharamsala, Himachal Pradesh, India, when I attended a scheduled initiation, and he kept delaying it day after day, spoiling my travel schedule because I didn't have all the time in the world. In the end, I got an anger instead of an initiation. Gelugpa Lama Tupten Zopa Rinpoche recently passed away on 13th April 2023. I wish he had attained nirvana. Another disappointment was when I was trying to eat a vegan diet and there was yak meat everywhere in the momos on the traditional Tibetan menu. My last disappointment was when the owner of a Tibetan guest house threw me out on the street because I got sick and spent the night going to the bathroom. I have not been back to Dharamsala since then. I worked selflessly as a professional journalist in the international campaign for human rights in Chinese-occupied Tibet, but I have had no contact with my Tibetan brothers and sisters since then. Osel Ita. I met personally at the Oseling Retreat Center in the Alpujarra, the boy Oselita Torres, before he was declared by the Dalai Lama as Tulku or reincarnation of Lama Tupten Yeshe, but he renounced the official recognition when he came of age, and I understand that perfectly well. But he did not renounce his monthly pension he receives from the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, and I understand that too, because life is very hard. In 1972, the Tibetan religious community considered it undesirable to teach Westerners. For that reason, other Tibetans called Lama Yeshe as Paisa Lama, it is to say, someone who was mainly interested in money. In 1974, Lamas began to tour and teach in the West. As a result of their travels, a worldwide network of centers for Buddhist teachings and meditation was created, the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. Kalu Rinpoche. I was initiated into Tibetan Buddhism in Madrid by the famous Lama Kalu Rinpoche, who died on 10th May 1989 in his Sonada Monastery in Darjeeling. On 17th September 1990, Kalu's Tulku was born in Darjeeling, India, called Kalu Yangtze. On 28 February 1993, Kalu Yangtze was enthroned, and I went to visit him in Darjeeling. In the autumn of 2011, Kalu Yangtze gave a talk at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. At the end of the talk, a student in the audience asked for his perspective on sexual abuse in the West. Kalu revealed that he had been abused, paused, and then broke down, revealing for the first time that he had been abused at the age of 12 by senior monks at the monastery he attended. Shortly afterwards, he posted a video on YouTube to stop the story becoming unsubstantiated gossip. Unfortunately, there have been reports and allegations of sexual abuse in some Tibetan Buddhist communities. These cases often involve spiritual teachers who have abused their position of authority to sexually harass or assault students and followers. These reports of abuse have been of great concern to the Buddhist community and have led to further examination and reflection on issues of power and the dynamics of the teacher-disciple relationship in Tibetan Buddhism. Many Buddhist communities have begun to address these issues more actively, including the creation of clear codes of conduct and the implementation of reporting and accountability processes. The human condition. Many religions and philosophies seek to give a meaning to the human condition. Martin Heidegger, André Malraux, Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre, and José Ortega y Gasset have all talked about it. Other thinkers, such as Enrique Fermi, deny, as I do, that the human nature has changed over time. The term is sometimes used in literature to describe the joy and terror of being and existence. André Malraux wrote The Human Condition, a mixture of loneliness in the face of fate, dignity in the face of adversity, solidarity with the disadvantaged, and a yearning for transcendence. It is set during the Communist Revolution in China in 1927 and won the Goncourt Prize in 1933. Also, The Human Condition is a Japanese epic film trilogy directed by Masaki Yobayashi about the effect of World War II on a pacifist Japanese man named Kaji, who is assigned to a coal mine in a remote corner of occupied Manchuria. There, many of the workers are Chinese prisoners of war who carry out their work in subhuman conditions, treated as if they were animals. There are many people in the world who experience a full and satisfying life, while others struggle with challenges and hardships. While it is true that human beings experience pain, suffering, sadness, and other negative aspects of life, it is also true that human beings have the capacity to experience happiness, love, creativity, altruism, and many other positive emotions and experiences. Ultimately, the human condition is complex and multifaceted and cannot be reduced to a single idea or perspective. While it is true that life can be difficult and challenging at times, it is also true that there is much potential for happiness, fulfillment, and personal and spiritual growth in human life. Messages. Sex becomes a new religion according to Poet Dog. Sexual force manifests itself through materialism. When the dance between men and women is more or less balanced, families are one thing. Life flows in predictable routes. Civilization exists in some form. We had romance in the air, but the electronic media deformed it. You have divine powers, whether you like it or not, says Ranra. You have the power to transform a universe steeped in negativity into a universe steeped in the positivity of light, love, and the glory of the one infinite creator. Cobra Mission Status Report April 2023. Pandora in progress. Sign of Field M substable. Security breach recovery complete. Dreamland V0.9 operational. Ring space activated. Kill sequence 9 in progress. RR12. Minimum M, HP, SD, DL, and MDS requirements met. VTX requirements not met. This appears to be an operation codenamed Pandora, involving artificial intelligence technology called Dreamland, and a specific target being eliminated or destroyed. There also appears to have a previous security breach that has been fixed. And that's all for today. Thanks a lot, dear friends.